Hi, I'm Evan Dixon, Vice President of Communications for Crestborn. I'm glad to introduce our first panel of the day, Driving Forward Emissions Reduction in the Transportation Sector. Achieving global decarbonization in the transportation sector is challenging. Our expert panelists today will share the progress the industry has made to reduce emissions and the regulatory challenges they still face. Join me in welcoming our moderator, Bob Stout, Senior Fellow for the Duke University Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability.
Welcome, everyone, to what I promise you will be a very exciting and fascinating discussion of a really important issue, and that is how do we drive forward emissions reduction in the transportation sector. It's one of the most complex and far-ranging sectors, and one like many where the United States has a key role to play in our own economy, but also in driving emissions reductions across the globe. And we are very lucky to have a quite distinguished panel here that brings expertise across these sectors and is able to talk to us about the challenges they face as teed up at the beginning, but I think also some of the opportunities and how policy can help drive reduction and addressing those challenges as well as exploiting those opportunities. So we have with us today, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. We actually have 2 Juris Doctors and 2 PhD doctors, starting with Theresa Romanowski. Theresa is the Assistant General Counsel for the Association of American Railroads. She is broadly responsible for not only the legal, but also the regulatory and policy aspects of the environment and climate, including decarbonization issues. And of course, the railroad industry is critical not only as a producer of certain emissions that need to be reduced and addressed, and in some ways a challenging framework in that regard, but also in providing transportation for biofuels, et cetera. So we'll be happy to hear from her. We also have Dr. Gavin Towler, who is the Vice President and Chief Scientist for Sustainable Technologies for Honeywell. And his job is really driving sustainable technology across the company. And of course, it's a very wide-ranging company contributing to emissions reductions across many sectors of our economy. He brings 30 years of experience in chemicals and numerous executive roles in Honeywell and related companies, and has 77 U.S. patents to his name. We also have Dr. Tamid Mizan from ExxonMobil. He's the Global Regulatory Development Manager for ExxonMobil, and he's responsible for identifying, assessing, and responding to policy developments as they affect Exxon and its many global businesses across the world. He has a long and very distinguished career with ExxonMobil, with executive roles in strategy, regulatory affairs, and technology involving fuels, lubricants, refining, and he is also an inventor with patents in clean fuels to his name. And last but certainly not least, we have Jeff Clark. Jeff is the Vice President of Regulatory and Government Affairs for the Natural Gas Vehicle Association of America, which is advocating for the use of natural gas in the transportation sector in particular. He also has a long career in energy policy and regulatory affairs in many different roles, including prior roles with the American Gas Association, New West Technologies, the National Renewable Energies Laboratory, and the Department of Energy. So with these panelists, we cover so much of the sector and so many overlapping issues as it will affect the sector. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to hear from each of our panelists, starting with Theresa Romanowski, kind of the situation the view from their chair, the issues, the challenges, and opportunities they're dealing with. So thank you and welcome, Theresa.
Thanks so much, Bob, and thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to be here on behalf of America's railroads to talk about decarbonization and how we can get to a lower emissive transportation sector. I'm Theresa Romanowski. I represent AAR, and AAR works on behalf of the United States and, well, North American railroads, the Class 1 railroads, several of the smaller railroads, and passenger railroads as well. Within the rail industry, we're really proud of our environmental bona fides and the work that we've done to reduce both criteria pollutant emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. We've invested heavily in different technologies and different innovations that reduce emissions across the board and across our operations. And as a result of those investments, you can see there, we have really great statistics that demonstrate that, today's trains can move 1 ton of freight, an average of 500 miles on a single gallon of fuel. And so if you just think about, maybe how long you can drive on a single gallon of fuel in your car, you'll realize that that's a really impressive statistic. And that statistic represents a 25% improvement in fuel efficiency over the last 23 years. So that's a lot of investment and a lot of research and directed focus in reducing emissions and improving fuel efficiency. The freight rail network is responsible for moving a significant portion of the United States and global supply chain, the freight over land. But we represent only about 1.7% of U.S. transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a pretty small footprint when you look at the transportation sector overall, but there's a lot of room and improvement to be made even within our own small footprint. And as a result of, in the interest of that, AAR's members have been spending a lot of time and effort in researching new technologies and additional ways to further reduce our emissions. A couple of examples, we are working on researching the use of biofuels, so renewable diesel and biodiesel in our existing locomotive fleet. The use of those fuels not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but it also reduces criteria pollutant emissions. And that's a really desirable path forward in the short and medium term, because those fuels can be dropped right into our existing locomotive fleet and make it a nice transitional fuel for the next 10, 15, 20 years to get us to that next version of technology, those alternative propulsion mechanisms that don't require internal combustion engines. If we looked at longer term, we're testing battery electric locomotives in different situations within our operations, within our yards, and sometimes on our main lines. And fuel cell locomotives, hydrogen fuel cell locomotives. Again, that's a zero emission technology. Both of those zero emission technologies have challenges associated with them. If we think about batteries, there are limits to how much power you can get out of a single battery built today. Batteries coming off the line right now are about 2.4 megawatt hours worth of power. In order to replace a 5,000 gallon diesel locomotive, you need about 80 to 100 megawatt hours. There's a huge gap there between the energy and the power that we need and what we can produce today. And when we think about hydrogen fuel cells, there are issues associated with the energy involved in converting hydrogen into a usable fuel, and whether in the end, after doing that, does it make sense? And so there's a lot more thought and a lot more research that has to be done. Those locomotives are not commercially viable right now, but a lot of work is being done to test them and demonstrate their use across the United States rail network. When we think about different policies and ways that we can promote the transition to a lower emission or zero emission transportation sector, I think it's really important that policymakers keep in mind that mandates and timeframes that don't work with the practical realities on the ground are not going to benefit that transition overall. And what we worry about is unintended consequences that could, divert, for example, freight movement from a very efficient and energy and environmentally conscious mode of transportation like rail to less efficient and less environmentally sustainable modes of transportation. And so we would ask that, programs benefit development and benefit research, but stay away from requiring certain technologies in specific situations. Thanks.
Okay, hi there, everybody. Gavin Towler with Honeywell. So for those of you who aren't all familiar with Honeywell's background, we're a company that's in multiple industries. The sort of common thread across most of what Honeywell does is systems, automation, digital technology. So we do a lot of things where we make a sensor that detects something and then transmits a signal to a computer that calculates something and then sends something to an actuator. So you find Honeywell systems in chemical plants, you find them controlling buildings, you find them controlling aircraft. In the particular area of decarbonizing transportation, I have some background in this one because I'm Honeywell's Chief Sustainability Officer since the beginning of August. But before that, I was in my 25 years career with Honeywell UOP, developing technologies for the oil, gas, petrochemical industry. And so we are a big part of helping America's energy companies continue to provide us with the energy security that we need, with the fuels that we need for all different forms of transportation. Honeywell, of course, is very big in the aerospace area, and we are working actively with the airframe manufacturers and the airlines to come up with technologies that will enable us to keep flying in the future. Aviation is critical to our modern way of life in so many ways, not just the ability to travel and go places, the ability to go on vacations, but to fly between countries. I'm an immigrant to this country. My family don't live here. I do like to go and visit them sometimes. I know that 200 years ago, that would have involved several months on a ship. We do not want to go back to that. We want to have aviation in the future. And we can do it with lower emissions by developing new fuels. And so we've been working a lot with all of the major oil refining companies around expanding the pool of sustainable aviation fuel. This is technology that was developed here in America. I live in the Midwest in Chicago. We were the first ones to come up with sustainable aviation fuel here. We were doing demonstration flights now nearly 15 years ago. And the first sustainable aviation jet fuel plant in the world is in Los Angeles. And the technology is now something that we're deploying to multiple sites, not only here in the USA, but also around the world. So it's creating an export potential for us. And the key thing with sustainable aviation fuel, the route we have at the moment goes from waste fats, oils, and greases, and there's not a very large supply of that. So we're trying to expand the pool of available feedstocks. In particular, we're talking to the ethanol industry. And this is another area where America leads the world in ethanol production. And as more people switch to driving electric vehicles and reduce the demand for gasoline for cars, it is really important that we sustain that ethanol industry. It provides a lot of rural jobs. It provides income to many, many people across the heartland of America. And so we're working with the ethanol industry to look at new routes that will let us turn ethanol into sustainable aviation fuel. And then potentially even in the future, looking at green hydrogen and carbon capture and other routes that will go to synthetic aviation fuel by actually taking CO2 out of the air. Beyond the aerospace sector, we continue to develop clean renewable diesel fuel for some of the applications like railroads, but we're increasingly interested also in hydrogen. We're working with ExxonMobil on the world's largest blue hydrogen plant that's going to be built in Baytown in Texas. So they're going to build a plant using our carbon capture technology that'll capture 7 million tons a year of hydrogen, and Exxon's going to sequester that. So when it comes to policies and what we need from regulators, the most important thing is to have clarity and stability around getting the situation where projects can actually get done. We need to have very clear permitting guidelines, particularly if we're going to drive more carbon capture and sequestration. This matters for the ethanol industry. Ethanol produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct. It's 100% pure carbon dioxide off the fermenters. It's like the easiest ethanol to capture. We just need to be able to get the pipelines so we can re-inject it, and so people in that industry can take advantage of some of the tax credits that you've already passed. And same thing goes for the large point sources of carbon dioxide in the refineries around the Gulf Coast. It's very easy to get that carbon dioxide. It's not cheap. The technology exists, but we can capture that carbon dioxide. That can actually lower the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the refineries. It can lower the carbon intensity of the fuels that we currently use. But we need to be able to get the permits and get the pipelines to capture that CO2 and pipe it out to suitable sequestration sites.
Well, thank you. Again, I'm Tamid Mizan. I work for ExxonMobil Product Solutions Company. And just to tell you the kind of different products that we manufacture and sell in the Product Solutions Company, it's fuels, energy products that you're familiar with, gasoline, diesel, and the like, lubricants for your engines, but also plastics and chemicals. So, the energy transition and supply or sourcing of energy is very, very important to our business. ExxonMobil is committed to creating sustainable solutions that improve the quality of life for everybody and meet societal's evolving needs in a way that protects people, protects the environment, protects the communities in which we live. Specifically with respect to greenhouse gases, I can quote Darren Woods, who's our chairman and CEO, in saying that we respect and support society's ambitions to achieve net zero by 2050 and continue to advocate for policies that promote cost-effective and market-based solutions to address the risks of climate change. So policy is very, very important to advancing those solutions. In terms of what we are doing in response to the energy transition, ExxonMobil is, again, committed to improving that quality of life. And in the near term, from 2022 to 2027, we plan to invest about $17 billion on lower emissions initiatives, technologies, commercializing, as Gavin mentioned, carbon capture and sequestration, not only in the US Gulf Coast, but also in potential projects throughout the world. Intend to look at producing low carbon intensity hydrogen, as well as biofuels, which we call low emission fuels. And in terms of low emission fuels, our ambitions are to supply more than 40,000 barrels per day. That's about 600 million gallons per year of lower emission fuels by 2025. And a further goal of about 200,000 barrels per day. That's 3 billion gallons per year by 2030. We've got several projects that are in flight. In particular, I can point to a renewable diesel project that our affiliate Imperial Oil in Canada is implementing in its Strathcona refinery. That unit will produce 20,000 barrels a day of renewable diesel for the Canadian market with a startup planned in 2025. So investments are important, but we believe that policies are equally important. And some of my preceding panel members have pointed to the need for durable and certain policies that help to advance these or help to unlock greenhouse gas emissions technology. And so we're taking a leading role in talking about policies, talking about the right kind of policies, advocating for policies that enable technologies that would lower emissions from the transportation sector. I'll say a couple of other things. It's not just the road sector that we're focusing on. We have activities in the harder to abate transportation sectors. In particular for aviation, we've already supplied on a test basis sustainable aviation fuel in Europe and in Asia. And for marine fuels, we have also supplied, again, on a test basis, fuels in Northwest Europe as well as in Singapore. So we are active and looking forward to this challenge. We think carbon capture will be a major element of it. And my previous panelist, Dr. Towler, spoke about ExxonMobil's project that we're looking at in the Gulf Coast to really make a large dent in terms of carbon capture and sequestration and the impact it can have on emissions reductions. If policies are supportive and enabling, we think a lot of these technologies, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's lower carbon intensity natural gas, whether it's electrics, whether it's lower carbon intensity liquid fuels for conventional engines, all of these technologies can be enabled by the right policy, and hope we'll get to talk about that in the coming minutes here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jeff Clark, NGV America. We are a national trade association representing the full value chain of companies in the natural gas vehicle industry, including fuel providers, fuel transporters, vehicle and equipment manufacturers, fueling station builders, fuel retailers, and consumers also. So when we talk about natural gas, we mean the same fuel that is used in millions of homes for cooking and heating and for electric power generation. Most of the natural gas used in the US for transportation is compressed natural gas, or CNG, stored in pressurized vessels. Some fuel is liquefied natural gas, or LNG, that has been cooled to allow greater storage density. And when our members talk about vehicles, we're generally focused on the on-road transportation with an emphasis on medium and heavy-duty trucks and buses. The most common natural gas vehicles in use today in the US are transit and shuttle buses and refuse trucks. This year, our publication, Decarbonized Transportation with Renewable Natural Gas, reported that 69% of all the natural gas being used in on-road transportation today is renewable natural gas, or RNG, produced from landfills, dairy farm waste, and municipal solid waste. This RNG is basically methane that has been produced by decomposing organic waste or biomass. Producing this fuel prevents emissions and provides energy for use. And in 2022, we estimate that this RNG offset 5.6 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. The natural gas vehicles have an excellent track record of achieving demanding emission standards. They have been some of the first vehicles certified to the ultra low and super low emission standard, and more recently certified to the heavy duty optional low NOx standard, as well as the near zero emission standards in California. From a greenhouse gas perspective, this RNG used today is often carbon neutral or negative. The average carbon intensity of renewable natural gas sold in California in 2022 was negative 92. One of the things that's really exciting today going forward for our industry is the soon to be available 15-liter Cummins natural gas engine. This is an important development for our industry because it means that long haul and regional haul operators of large trucks, Class 8 trucks, will soon be able to order new natural gas trucks capable of pulling the largest loads allowed. So we think that natural gas has some key advantages over other options like electric and fuel cell trucks in achieving immediate penetration in the Class 8 truck market, including a lower price point, longer range capabilities, and an existing network of truck-ready fueling stations. Another important factor in its favor is that natural gas is probably the least disruptive of the technologies, the clean technologies under consideration for this market, because the fueling experience and range capabilities, our trucks get 500 plus miles driving range, means that fleets can move the natural gas today without rethinking their logistics or reducing payload or purchasing more trucks than they currently operate. The challenge we're facing as an industry is more from regulators really than from other fuels. Regulators in many cases are insisting on zero carbon emissions, and that increasingly means zero tailpipe emissions. So that means that RNG and other low carbon biofuels do not qualify for credits or satisfy purchase mandates in these new programs. Despite the carbon negative rating of RNG sold in California, California regulations do not give credit to RNG as part of their vehicle regulations. The impact of that is that it's felt much beyond California because many other states are looking at adopting their requirements for trucks. And we're similarly challenged by some of the EPA regulations that look to require an increasingly larger share of zero emission vehicles because of the way they define zero and because they do not provide credits for biofuels. So on the regulatory front, I think there are some reasons to be optimistic. There are some challenges to these regulations that could potentially bring about some flexibility. In Europe, they've recently shown a willingness to allow e-fuels, including biofuels, to participate in their zero emission regulations. Hopefully that will resonate with regulators here. And we're pleased to note that our members, Hyliion and Cummins, recently have certified Hyliion's ERX technology to the near zero emission standard, allowing it to earn partial credit in these programs I was talking about. So it gets treated as a zero emission vehicle for purposes of compliance. This truck is equipped with a natural gas engine, but it only uses the engine as a genset to produce electricity. And it's capable of operating in all electric mode with the engine running without the engine running for a significant number of miles. So we're really excited about that development. It's very promising. And we think that in the future, that development, and if we can get some more flexibility from regulators, we think there'll be a great opportunity for natural gas trucks. Thank you for allowing us to share these thoughts with you, and I welcome the additional discussion. Thank you.
So thank you to all our panelists. You really wove a very rich tapestry on how your businesses and the industries you represent are very much in action in dealing with decarbonization in various ways in the transportation sector. Just to mention for those watching, if you have questions, you can feel free to put those into the chat. We're moving now into a question and answer session. And I'm going to begin it using moderator's prerogative by asking a question. Woven through many of your comments were comments about the importance of policy, either as an enabler or as a barrier to the things that you are trying to do in your businesses. You use the terms clarity, stability, durability of policy, flexibility, and open to a variety of different low carbon technologies and not unduly prescriptive or picking winners and losers. So what I'd like you to do now is dig a little bit deeper, because I know we have many members of our audience who are here who are really interested in specific policy proposals and ideas. So I'd like to invite each of you and ask you to talk about one specific policy idea that would either help be an enabler or remove some of the barriers to you and your business, either a change in existing policy or a new policy that would be helpful. And I guess we'll start with you, Theresa, again.
Sounds good. You know, I think the big thing, and we've touched on this already, like you said, is the flexibility. I think right now a lot of people are talking about, when you're thinking about decarbonizing the transportation sector, a lot of people are focused solely on electrification. And I think that's a mistake. I think that, you know, some states right now, California being one of them, have, you know, suggested that, you know, electrification can kind of be a, you know, one size fits all solution to decarbonization in the transportation sector. The fact is, cars and trucks are not the same as, you know, airplanes and locomotives. And so there are limitations to relying solely on electrification. And so my recommendation, I think, to policymakers is to think more broadly, like we said, think about flexibility, and remember that, you know, for a lot of industries, we're just starting down this path. And there are going to be solutions that we're not even thinking about right now. And so as we draft regulations and we think of policies, we need to keep an open mind and draft everything in a way such that, you know, hydrogen could be a solution, electrification could be a solution, and other technologies that we haven't thought about and that are still under development, those can be solutions as well. And so that's the one thing I'd like to ask policymakers and regulators to keep in mind, is that flexibility and an open mind as we move forward.
Thank you, Theresa. And I guess we'll stay in the same order. And Gavin, is there a particular, you referenced several things that you're involved in, including some work with ExxonMobil. It's so great to see that cross-sector collaboration. But could you talk about maybe a particular issue, policy issue you're concerned about and working on?
I would say a particular issue for us is getting more clarity, particularly around timelines for CO2 pipelines and for Class 6 permits for CO2 injection. Because uncertainty in the timing of the pipeline process means uncertainty in the financing of projects. And there's, I think, something like 38 projects that are being held up because they can't get access to the pipeline permits they need. And obviously that rests with the states, and people need to have legitimate rights to voice concerns and everything. But if we're going to actually execute on these projects, we can't just give in to the NIMBYism, right? They're not in my backyard. There has to be some interest in actually seeing that the projects go forward. So maybe something that would cap the timelines, or at least give companies some clear view as to how they're going to get through the permitting process.
Thanks very much for that. And I'll also take that as a commercial for, I believe it may directly follow this one, but I know one of the other CRESS panels will be talking specifically about permitting reform, which is such an important priority for us today, for the business community and the policy community as well. So Tamid, I know that a big part of your job is thinking not only currently, but looking forward about what kinds of policies can help catalyze emissions reduction now and in the future. So what's a policy that you're working on where you'd really like to see some help?
Yes. So focusing and talking about transport sector in particular, when we look at policies that are on the books today, they're really not joined up and linked up to get the best effect in terms of allowing technologies to deliver those emissions reductions. And I think some of my previous panelists spoke about policies that are too narrowly focused, or perhaps not really focused on the right kind of metrics. We can look at the renewable fuel standard, for instance, on the fuel side, which has served us well over many years, over a decade, I think. But it's a volumetric standard, and it's really not proportional to the greenhouse gas reductions that those fuels can deliver. Vehicle policies, sale policies are tailpipe only, and don't really look at the entire life cycle of the emissions profile of that use of that technology. And so what we believe is a better approach is to promote technology neutral, life cycle greenhouse gas based policies, which are standards. So a fuel standard matched up with a well-to-wheels vehicle standard. And these would, we think, act together to lead to faster and greater greenhouse gas emissions reductions than current approaches. What is missed in a great sense by current approaches is that, for instance, just a singular focus electrification is, what about the existing fleet on the road today? I think there are about 300 million vehicles on the road in the US. How do you address that? So we need policies that are linked up and harmonized, that can get to work on reducing emissions from existing vehicles, but also promote the sale or encourage the sale of lower emission vehicles consistent with the lower emission energy sources that are going to be out there in the marketplace, whether they be lower emissions, hydrogen, electricity, compressed natural gas, or liquid fuels for gasoline and diesel engines. So that's what we think would be effective. Such a policy does not rely on government funding or subsidies. It's a market-based policies. This policy would enable and promote and maintain choices for consumers, would retain high-paying jobs throughout the economy in the transport and energy sectors. But most importantly, to Theresa's point and to Gavin's point, would encourage innovation and allow those technologies that are yet to surface to have its day in the sun as well. So innovation, competition, choice, all of that, and getting to faster greenhouse reductions is what we can offer through this technology approach.
Thank you, Tamid. Jeff, what are you working on, or what keeps you up awake at night?
Yeah, I think the other panelists really provide a lot of great information that I agree with. So what keeps us up at night, that's a good way to frame it. And I'll keep going back to California, and I'll explain why. And California is one of the biggest markets in the country, so they're important for that respect. But they have that outside outsized impact because of the way the Clean Air Act is, that they draw up these vehicle regs. They focus on tailpipe, not upstream, as the other panelists were saying. When it comes to climate change, we should care about all the emissions, not just the tailpipe. And the rub there is that the biofuels, which can provide carbon neutral or carbon negative benefits, don't get credit because we're not looking at the upstream emissions in those tailpipe standards. So I would focus on that, and then I would just offer up that, the reason we keep going back to California is because all these other states, the Clean Air Act lets them piggyback on California and adopt those regulations. And the frustrating part is a lot of the states, when they hold these hearings to talk about these rules, they say, well, our hands are tied. We really can't change the program because the Clean Air Act says we just got to basically vote it up or down and adopt California's rules the way they exist. And so even if they think there's value in providing more flexibility, their argument is that we can't. The law doesn't allow us to do that. So it's back to California, unless the courts do something.
Thank you, Jeff. And we've had a couple of questions from the audience related to a topic that's of great interest, not surprisingly, hydrogen. And a question about hydrogen in long-haul transport and the costs of that versus electrification. And just the people would be interested in your general thoughts on how big of a role and what role you see hydrogen playing and over what time period. So I'll just open that up to whoever would like to answer first. Yes, Gavin.
Okay, well, I touched on hydrogen, so I guess I'm asking for that one a little bit. We think hydrogen can play a very big role in the future, right? Hydrogen, there's two different ways you can make it. There's the plant that ExxonMobil's building in Baytown at the moment, right? Blue hydrogen, where you start from natural gas. You produce the hydrogen and you capture a very, very high amount of the CO2. 98% of the carbon dioxide associated with that plant is actually going to be captured and sequestrated, right? That technology is good to go. It's deployable at scale. It's basically the way that hydrogen is made in every refinery in North America at the moment. It's just that not all of them have carbon capture because, as we said, it's hard to get the permits for the carbon capture and other reasons. But that's a proven technology at scale. And then there's green hydrogen, which is something you can do when you've got surplus solar power or wind power, right? When we get to the point where the grid is net zero, when we're not there yet, but when we get to the point where the grid is awash with renewable power and renewable power continues getting cheaper and cheaper, you could use renewable power to electrolyze water and make green hydrogen. The reason hydrogen is interesting to us is for in the transportation sector, it might potentially at some point in the future be useful for aircraft, but it can be burned in diesel engines more or less now with some level of modification to diesel engines. So it's internal combustion engine technology, but to the point that was made, you've got an existing fleet of vehicles out there for heavy goods transport. And that's a lot of capital that a lot of people have committed. You don't want to be writing all of that off and saying, well, you're going to go out and buy new battery vehicles. And those battery vehicles are going to take a long time to charge, particularly when you look at charging them safely. They can't all be on fast charges the whole time. So hydrogen allows you to fuel quickly. And that means that for fleets of vehicles where you want to be refueling them and getting them back on the road or back into the mine or back into whatever duty they're serving, off-road vehicles for agriculture, all these kinds of things, hydrogen's a very good fuel to have because it can substitute out diesel. And by the way, also compressed natural gas is another really good fuel for those same sort of applications. This is not a one-size-fits-all. It shouldn't be pick one solution here. But we see hydrogen playing a role in that segment of the heavy goods vehicles and off-road vehicles. It's probably not in the near term. It's going to take a while to develop the fueling infrastructure. It's going to take even longer to develop things like fuel cells. But conversations that we have with a lot of the HGV engine manufacturers say that they think that they can do hydrogen internal combustion engine revamps, modifications fairly easily. And so that can enable hydrogen to help reduce emissions in the nearer term, but not in the very, very near term.
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak to hydrogen? Yes, Theresa.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think we have the same perspective as far as a lot of promise in the hydrogen world. I think there are some challenges which we've already touched on, but the benefit would be like you said, it's a drop in fuel in some instances. You can modify existing heavy duty equipment to work with hydrogen and other fuels. And when you think about when you're comparing and contrasting between battery electric technology and hydrogen fuel cell technology, batteries have to charge, and so you have to have that charging infrastructure kind of close by in order for that to work. That's not going to work in a line haul or long haul situation where you're moving across the country. And that's a benefit to hydrogen. You can move that in a tender, or you can move that in a fuel cell. There are lots of alternatives for options for how you can get that to accompany your engine and facilitate that use that aren't available unless there are huge advances in battery technology in the next couple of years. Batteries just can't do that today.
And one more thing, if I could add as well, and it's not rag on batteries time, but one thing that we do have to understand with batteries, a lot of the minerals that go in batteries are not things that are produced in North America, right? So from an energy security standpoint, we have the ability to make our own hydrogen, right? We've got abundant natural gas. We've got great sites for carbon sequestration. So we can do blue hydrogen now, even if we don't have the renewable fuels. But batteries are reliant on imported materials that come from some places that can be difficult to deal with. So it's just another factor to keep in mind about hydrogen versus electric.
Thank you for raising that. It's always important to keep the energy trilemma in mind: sustainable, but also secure. And then I'm going to mention affordable. And just in the last couple of minutes, invite maybe Tamid, you want to speak to this? I know there are concerns with fuel standards and so on, that those could raise gasoline prices and make fuels less affordable. Interested in your thoughts on how we manage that in this current economy.
Yeah, let me start, Bob, by talking about, in general, the price of gasoline and diesel energy products that you see in the marketplace. These are commodities, really, and largely determined by the price of the crude oil from which they are produced. Crude, of course, is a globally traded commodity, and the price is set by buyers and sellers reacting to supply and demand. And when there's a market imbalance, when, for instance, demand exceeds supply, you start to see higher prices, or supply exceeds demand, prices lower. And such imbalances can happen, as we've seen in terms of events such as the global pandemic or the Ukraine war and the like. So that's one important element to observe, that there is natural volatility in the price of the base energy that supplies transportation. Now, talk about the impact of clean fuels on top of that. What is the likely impact? So what I can point to is historical data. So, for instance, there's been a fuel standard, a low carbon fuel standard in place in California for over a decade now, and analysts looking at that data from, let's say, 2011 to 2021 have estimated approximately about a 2.5 cent per year increase in the cost of gasoline in that market. So, of course, past history is not necessarily a predictor of the future. So if you had a global fuel, a national federal fuel policy, how might this play out? It's unknowable. But if that is any guide, what it suggests to me is that what you might see in terms of clean fuels impact is probably within the natural volatility of the excursions of prices that you would see in your local gas pump. So I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you, Tamid. And all of your comments were most helpful. This has really been an outstanding panel. I want to thank all of you for your contributions, and also thank our audience for tuning in.